All right, it's 5 minutes in, so I think we could get started. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you again. I was out the last 3 weeks. Sorry, I missed. I guess we had 2 weeks off, right, for the 2 different holidays, so it's been a while. So welcome back, everyone. As a reminder, if you could add your name to the attendee list in the meeting notes, which I just pasted in the chat, that would be appreciated. I have 8 people here. I synced with Joshua Locke briefly this morning, so he kind of filled me in a little bit what went on in the previous meetings. If you have any agenda items, please add them to the list. The first item, Joshua wanted to briefly just talk about rules of engagement for the meeting and kind of the purpose of the meeting. Just to remind everyone that we're intending these meetings to get like high-level agreement on approach, but then we'll work out like the actual details, in pull requests or something like that. And so we don't necessarily need to agree on all the details, just as long as we're generally in the right direction enough that people could go off and start doing things, just to avoid kind of like rat holing in specific issues. So that's it. I don't know if there's any more to be said about that. The first item on the agenda was by Emmy, Joshua Mulliken, and Laura about trademarking and licensing.
Hey, yeah. Oh, Josh. Oh, you're here. Okay, great. I'll let you go ahead.
Sweet.
Sorry.
Yeah, just kind of going back to, I know it was a previously discussed topic, but I thought it might be valuable to kind of bring up an idea. I know part of the issue originally discussed was, well, it's hard to obviously assess compliance with SLSA for everyone who claims SLSA compliance. However, I was thinking about an approach that some other organizations have taken, which is where you can specifically license a badge, for example, where the badge can only be used if you meet certain requirements. And so that would get legal at companies involved. Before they're able to use the badge, legal would have to do a review. Otherwise, they could get in trouble at a future date. And that would take all the burden off of this organization to assess anything. And then if they were not complying and, a customer potentially of a company found that the company they're buying products from or services was not fully complying, then there would be a kind of some sort of argument to remove that badge. So I was wondering what everyone thought about that potential use case for, kind of using licensing, trademark law, license law, in order to ease our burden, but also gain consistency in organizations claiming to have high compliance.
So question, what about the little people in open source that may not have a legal team, right? But they want to claim that whatever package that they've produced and the way they've produced it is SLSA compliant.
I think probably a good faith, attestation through some sort of license agreement would be fine for a smaller organization, because they would have full knowledge of what they're doing. Or maybe even an open source organization could, would be able to do a good faith understanding of themselves. But I think the risk here is that SLSA is going to get claimed by every company under the sun in order to sell product, and they're going to kind of we're going to end up in a situation where everyone's claiming SLSA level 4 and no one's actually doing SLSA level 4. And then who can trust SLSA? It's going to be used as a marketing tool. And I don't think open source communities have that kind of incentive to do that from a malicious standpoint. but will definitely be taken advantage of by companies with a market driving perspective. So
I think one challenge is that I don't know if we have universal agreement. I mean, I think so. I guess maybe I'll start with the positive. I think that's a good idea, and I'd not thought of that before, so I think that's interesting, and we should definitely keep it in mind. And maybe that solves like the technical enforcement piece, but I'm not sure that we have universal agreement on like even the standard of what would actually meet it. So, for example,
exactly, yeah.
if someone runs, I won't name it any specific brand, but like XYZ build service, and they, lock it down to some extent. But are there operational practices and implementation and design sufficient? I feel like that's kind of a judgment call, and some organizations might say yes and some might say no. And so even if there were like a legal argument, I don't know what standards we would be applying. Like the SLSA specification is a bit ambiguous in order to like apply the different cases.
I think that could be where, part of the trademark idea, if SLSA is trademarked, then no one can use it. And then we can kind of, as we think about, hey, what evidence is needed to say that you're SLSA 0? We haven't thought about that, or SLSA 1, sorry. We haven't thought about that yet, really. We don't quite know. We don't know exactly what that would look like. But as we understand it more and people continue to discuss it, oh, well, maybe we can come out with a badge for SLSA level 1. Oh, well, now we understand level 2 better. We understand it enough to say this is how you comply. Well, now we've come out with SLSA level 2 badge and the licensing allowing you to use it as a company, right? So I think we can do it without, we don't have to understand it, but I think we're going to be taken advantage of if we don't, we don't quite know what would meet the standard. It is a judgment call, but that needs to be ironed out. And if it's not ironed out, then it will be in a situation where we could be in a situation where it becomes all of a sudden SLSA is meaningless because everyone's SLSA level 4 because they went and judgment called that they're SLSA 4, even though it's not even clear how you get there yet.
Well, I guess it's a question. I don't know if it's for the SLSA organization or for the larger OpenSSF of, do we want to be in the business of certifying specific services implementations? Or do we want to say that no, that is not the business we want to be in, and offload it to another organization that does? That I think is a question that we need to answer.
Yeah, I don't think we probably want to be in the business of doing auditing. That's not necessarily our area of expertise, but I do think that providing controls to prevent the SLSA guide, the standard, having it be, well, this is a standard that helps you build a solid security, build solid security controls around building your software, versus this is a marketing term that you can use to trick people into using your product, even though it might not actually meet all the controls. That's the danger I see, is that people are going to see it. Oh, it's SLSA level 4. SLSA level 4 is a good standard. I read it. It's pretty cool. They must be doing a great job. And then they're going to get duped into buying something that might not be. And I don't want to participate. I don't think we should put ourselves in a position where we can participate in that, kind of potentially nefarious use of the standard.
Yeah, maybe put it another way. If in the absence of having such a badge that has like some sort of trademark enforcement, people will just start to do anything and there won't be anything for consumers effectively to pick. And so it would be wise to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
Jay?
So in the interest of making sure we stay within the scope of this meeting, we're talking about a lot of stuff that should be talked about in the positioning meeting and not the specification meeting. As a matter of fact, the implications of what we're talking about is exactly what should be discussed in this meeting. For instance, whether or not the controls that are within SLSA, whether or not they are written with enough rigor to potentially become some type of a compliance article that companies would use, with maybe a third-party organization to receive some type of a compliance. Then maybe a badge would be issued that could be defensible later on, right? But once again, the controls and the specification itself is what we talk about here. All the rest of that stuff is positioning. I think that might be out of scope for this meeting.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll readdress in the positioning then.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jay. So I wanted to continue to talk about the 1.0 proposal, but Sebastian and Preston, if the follow-on item is relatively short, maybe we could talk about that first.
I think it will be, but we don't necessarily have to jump the schedule. It's up to you folks. Okay.
All right.
So we're trying to decide, where our build system falls at Anaconda in terms of current SLSA level. And we ran into two places where things were a little vague, and one in particular that I thought at least drew some comment, or we both thought drew some comment here. And maybe this is more of a subject for, as you mentioned, I think for issues or PRs or something, but I haven't really discussed it here before, so I thought I'd get a sense of what's the level of certainty about these things and how fixed they are. So the level 2, there's a link in the agenda item. The level 2 provenance authenticated criterion has a should clause in it. I don't know, Preston, you have it currently up, but let's see. Right, suggesting that the private key is accessible only to the service generating the provenance, which, so this did something that, and this is also the thing that came up in tough conversations previously, but it sort of doesn't distinguish between like key exfiltration risk and like key use risk. And maybe that's fine, maybe that's part of the design, but I think it can easily be interpreted in a way that makes it sort of impossible, because you have to be able to access the key in order to rotate the key, for example, install the key in the first place, and maintain the system that it's on, whatever that is. But it also, I think, can be seen as pretty loose. So I thought, I don't know if you guys are in the business of putting in examples or anything in these. I haven't really seen many examples in them, but I just wanted to know if there was any thinking behind that or something, or if the proper venue for that is an issue. I don't know if Preston had anything else to add. But.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, can you file an issue for this and then tag it with the or CC me and I'll tag it with the clarification one. I think this is something that should be addressed for 1.0. I agree with what you said. I thought there was some other similar issue that was around key management as well. I'm trying to find it, but I can't KMS requirements to there's this somewhat similar issue around it being too prescriptive. If you want, I don't know if it's useful or not, if having two separate issues or just merging the issue and expanding it to cover the issue more broadly. Either way works, but I agree that we should do it. Having examples is yet another issue that we want to do for 1.0, and being more clear on what the guidance is would be valuable.
Okay. All right, we'll look at those and add some.
Sounds great. Great meeting notes. Similar issue. Issue or yeah, so I think we should get to that for 1.0. And yeah, and again, if we're working out the details of the wording, let's do it offline. Any other comments on that? Okay. So for the 1.0 proposal, my goal is to try to get toward being able to actually start implementing it, meaning updating the website. Excuse me. And so I think the two remaining, well, I think there's three major remaining things. One is the evidence of build security claims. I know I think it was discussed at last meeting. We have mostly agreement on it. There's some open questions. I think Melba is here, right? Yeah, Melba is here, who had a couple open questions. I propose that we mark that as basically decided, and we work out the details in the actual, write-up. But I think we're basically on the same page around the idea. Any objections to that? Okay, I will take that as an agreement. Oh, sorry, what was it called? Evidence of build security claims. As decided. Okay, and I'll leave the existing comments open, and if you have any comments here, if you could resolve them, that would be great. Either updating the text or just marking as resolved. I think we'll try to incorporate the ideas that were discussed in the comments in the actual pull request. And feel free to interrupt, by the way. The next was redefine levels as outcomes, not requirements. That one generally didn't have any traction in this group or with anyone. I propose that, here, actually I could present my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's see if this works. Okay. All right, I'm no longer muted. All right, you could hear me, right? So this section, redefine levels as outcomes, I propose that we just chop it out. I think the idea might still work, but we could just do it in a pull request and see if people like it, as opposed to having to agree on it in this meeting. I guess I'll say, any objections to that? Okay. Go ahead.
So I think one of the comments that I had was the original intent of SLSA is for it to be prescriptive. And so if we're not giving that, I wouldn't say detailed prescription, but if we're giving more detail than NIST as an example, right, then it helps people, because that was one of the arguments that I think I heard at the beginning when I first heard of SLSA. It's like, well, NIST is just giving you guidance of what you should do, but it's not prescriptive enough. And so if we don't give that level of detail, then we're kind of back to the state of where NIST is, and it's not as helpful or is not as, how should I say, people are looking for more guidance and less you should do this, but not tell you how to do it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, the intention was not to move away from that, but it was more like a theoretical thing of which is the, I don't know what the right term for it, like kind of the axioms or whatever, like the first principles, and which follow from that, of like, do you start with the requirements and then the threats that you address follow from the requirements, or do you start with the threats that you must address and therefore you must do these requirements? But I think it's just a very theoretical discussion anyway, and so it's probably not worth the time. I agree with you, and I don't think we should move away from being, the level of prescription that we currently have. Okay, sounds good. And I think the last remaining item, so I'll move this one. I'll update the doc. Is this policy verification piece. First, we need a better term because the word policy and verification are both overloaded and different people have different, comes to mind. I don't know what term that is, but so I'll continue saying policy for now. But I propose for this piece, actually I'll stop presenting because it's not useful, that
well, what do we mean by policy verification? Like what is the intent? What's the meaning of that? Policy verification. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, the wording is poor. The intent that I was trying to get at was that in order to achieve the goals and like address the threats that are listed, simply generating provenance is not sufficient, because like you generate data and then no one ever looks at it, and that's not stopping anyone, that's not detecting any attacks, that's not preventing any attacks, it's not doing anything. So some system somewhere has to actually take the provenance and look at it and make some sort of decision, whether that's blocking an action or sending an alert or doing something with it. And that is a missing piece in the current version. And so that's the concept I'd like to get in there. Does that make sense?
We talk about provenance. Now, provenance can mean different things in different contexts. What do we mean by provenance here?
The SLSA provenance, meaning how, like and you're right, that does need to be better defined because I think it's not fully specified. I think we need to fully specify what that means.
So there are a few terms that we're using in SLSA, and I'm just noticing this across all the meetings. There are a few terms that aren't universal terms. These terms mean different things in different places, depending upon the context in which they're used and what you're talking about. Now, for instance, when we talk about like open source components specifically, provenance just means that you can trace this component back to its origin, period, and its licensing and everything else. That means that you know where this component came from, you know from its licensing down to where it was, whatever repo it was in. You can trace this component back. That's the definition of provenance. When we talk about provenance here for SLSA, what are we talking about? What specifically does provenance mean in SLSA?
As a concrete, the suggested format is here. I just pasted a link, and in the salsa.dev/requirements, we list specifically the things that have to go in it. so this includes things like, so basically, when describing a software artifact, file or binaries or container image, something like that, what system produced it, and what were the inputs to it, and how was it produced?
Okay, so there's no difference in the, based on what I just read, there's no difference in the definition of provenance here. When we talk about policy verification, then with respect to provenance, what policy? And now keep in mind, I'm asking this question because I don't know that I disagree with the terminology specifically, unless the ends don't justify the means. What policy are we verifying with respect to provenance? And are we talking about a documented policy? Are we talking about a technical policy? What are we talking about specifically?
Yeah, so and that's the reason why, one of the reasons why I think the word policy is a poor choice of words here. Although I'm struggling to come up with a better word. I think in order to address the threats, which again are listed here, let me send a link in the chat here. In order to address like these threats, we need to have, there's certain things that must be done at like checks that have to happen to make sure that those threats have been addressed. Whatever term we call that. Some of those things are like done.
Well, that's just remediation verification at that point, right? You're just verifying that whatever risks that have been identified have been remediated. Well,
so like the specific things that I'm expecting are, one, like by policy, for a given software package, and this was presented maybe about a month ago by Vitsa. He had a proposal here. That like for a specific software package, we need to know what the canonical source location was, because if you consider building a library or any sort of package, doesn't matter. Let's say PyYAML, Python package. It's supposed to be built from github.com/YAML/PyYAML. If someone forks it and adds additional code to it, or just builds from something completely entirely, then that's not built from the correct package. And so we need to have some mapping or canonical information to know what the proper source location is for a given package, like what to expect, the expected source location. And that like definition should be resistant to tampering. So that way, if someone has the permissions to upload a malicious version of a package, they shouldn't also have the permission to just unilaterally change the expected value, or else otherwise the check doesn't really have much meaning. And so that is, I think that's like the most important bit of what needs to be done. I don't think it needs to be explicitly like written in like a policy format that's in whatever language. I think as long as that mapping exists and it is checked, that's kind of what we want. Melba, also you also raised your hand. Sorry.
I was gonna say something similar to what Sebastian said. Right? It's like you mentioned checks, right? So before you go GA as an example, or you do a final build, you have policy as code that checks, do you have any critical high? Are you getting, like Mark said, are you getting your packages from this internal repo as an example? Are you scanning with all the correct scanners? So I see it almost like as policy as code within the organization that one would have to check against. But I think the way Sebastian defined it in the chat, I think is a really good way of thinking about it.
let me copy this. If someone could copy the chat into the meeting notes, that would be really helpful. Sebastian or anyone else. Yeah, I think there's kind of two pieces here. There is what I would consider like the minimal piece, which is how do you, for a given package, which is identified in some way, for example, a particular name on PyPI, or a particular Maven package, or a container image package in a registry. What I think at a minimum, you need to be able to point to some source location where it's supposed to be. Any additional checks that's done by the maintainers, I think are, at least, so I'll speak for myself, I think are valuable and people will want that. I don't know if it's strictly required to address the threats that are listed in the SLSA thing, like around doing vulnerability scanning, et cetera. It seems like it's not specifically to address the tampering threat. What do you think, Elma?
I didn't quite follow all that. I heard
so if
it.
I understand correctly, you're saying you and Sebastian had mentioned that like having some policy of like, here's the checks I expect to happen before a
Yes.
package is supposed to be released.
Yes.
I didn't necessarily mean it as pre-release. I meant it as sort of like end-to-end, like what can be verified by the final user of the package, or what at any number of stages that occur, right? So I guess you could do that pre-build, but then it's not really build attestations. I guess source attestations you could do before build. So yeah, I guess if you had an Untitled style layout kind of thing, which is what I've sensed that you folks were talking about with policies, then yeah, I guess you could also verify it pre-build, because if there are any requirements made about the source, so you can always verify at each step, you know, what's supposed to happen at the end before that step. But ultimately, like all of it needs, well, I think all of it needs to be verifiable by the end user who received it. So it's not just about, you know, pre-build. Or maybe that was vague. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is the biggest kind of source of disagreement, or like, not even really disagreement, but lack of a common understanding that we have among our group. Because I think we each kind of have a different notion of how this works and what it does. I suspect the best way to do this would be to actually write something down. We could read it and see what it looks like, and then kind of shape that. And then we could just kind of iteratively do it, especially because discussions, every time someone says it, you kind of start from scratch. And so I guess maybe for this group, in order to start drafting something, one big question is like, if we have this concept, what exactly it goes into it is an open question. Is this piece part of the requirements of like the checkboxes of like, there's some difference between level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4? Or is it like a kind of a separate thing that's like, in addition to the requirements, you also need to do that? I guess like exactly how we put it in the documentation is open.
I guess one way to think about it is, you know, do you have, to think about it in our SLSA requirements kind of way, is like, do you have a way for the, you know, for the end user or for whatever tooling they're using, do you have a way for that to authenticate the provenance? And what does that mean, right? So I think that way you might be able to express it as like a SLSA requirement instead of just like a general guidance thing.
So this, yeah, okay. Provenance available requirements. Expanding the provenance available requirement. Yeah, something like that. So the challenge, I guess, here is that with the current version of SLSA, it's defined on an artifact basis, meaning like a thing that's identifiable by hash has a level. If you have two different versions of the package, meaning two different blobs of data, they can have different levels. When we talk about, I'll use the Untitled term, like the layout or like the expectations of what it is, that's no longer about a specific thing, but almost like a template of all future versions are expected to meet these requirements. And so exactly how to introduce it, it's a little bit challenging wording wise.
I don't want to belabor it, sorry. But
oh, we can't hear you, Sebastian.
oh, how about now? Okay, sorry. Hopefully I can retain what I was just thinking. Very short. I suppose you could, you could issue these kinds of things for individual artifacts, right? So suppose, it's the same way that, you go to a website and it lists SHA-256 hashes for artifacts you're about to download. In a sense, each one of them is a separate, a separate statement about what to expect from the artifact that you obtain, right? So you could do that. I think most of the value lies in not doing that and having something general, but I guess you could have like an in toto layout for one artifact if it was meaningful to have two separate places you could obtain these things from.
I think the big question is like, how do you know that the layout itself is authentic?
Yeah.
And if it's changing every time, that's kind of the big question. Is like if these things, these layouts or expectations or policies change, how do you know that the change is legit? One thing that kind of thought about is like a trust on first use model. For example, if you get a particular package and it's built from a particular source location, from a particular builder, then you would expect future versions to also be built from that same thing. So you almost have like an implicit layout or implicit policy. Then when those things do change, if it's rare, maybe there's some way of identifying safe ones of like, you could have like pointers from the old location to the new location or something like that. Or alternatively, just say like, if you have to do a hard break, that's like changing your SSH key and like people get prompts and like, just don't do that. Because it's like a security relevant thing and people have to make a decision to trust it. Isaac.
I guess one of the questions I'd have about this is, I mean, have we categorically decided that this problem is in scope for the SLSA specification? And I ask because, I mean, it seems to me this is similar in a way to, cryptography where, there's some mechanism for key exchange, but, not all specifications are going to specify how you do the key exchange. They may start from the proposition that you have exchanged keys securely. Okay, once you've done that, here is the implementation of the secure exchange of information using those keys. But how you actually generate or exchange those keys in the first place may be out of scope for certain specifications. And it seems like we have a similar problem here where we're talking about something which, to your point, exists almost outside of the scope of SLSA, that this is an attribute of the project or the resource rather than the artifact. And SLSA's language and framing is all around the artifact. And I think that's something which, and it seems like we'd need to break out into almost a different dimension in order to address this problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, personally, I don't think I would say that SLSA should require a particular means of setting that. at least in my head, it would be something like using your key exchange analogy of like, there must, you must do a secure key exchange, and maybe recommend like, unless you have reason to do otherwise, like this is how we recommend it, or for open source, this is a particular recommended way.
Got it. Okay.
But I wouldn't, preclude other implementations that do it a different way. At least that's me.
So could this be a recommendation that consumers should do some validation of this, and then we leave it unsaid as to the mechanism, or do you feel strongly that there needs to be a recommendation that is specified around how that should is accomplished?
I think what happens when we leave this to end users, is historically demonstrated by, GPG signing and keys and SHAs on websites and stuff. And I know that's easy to say, it's harder to solve the problem. But like at a minimum, if you don't have a way of mapping like expected keys to artifacts or namespaces of artifacts or something, then you've sort of constructed a system where, the signing and verification are a little bit feeder.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the GPG example is a good one. You've kind of left the hard parts to everyone else, and gosh, I mean, ultimately, adoption is going to succeed or fail based on are people able to accomplish the hard parts consistently and well and without error.
Yeah. And then,
Right, So I suggest that basically, similar to the previous year, I think what might be useful is just to start putting something together, put a draft together and see what people think. My inclination is to start with like I don't know if it's a different page or what, but something that's not in the, I don't know, and whether or not it's in the checklist, something that describes the overall flow of like, in the model of like, not just there's source and then a build and an output artifact, but like when in the salsified version, there's a source, there's a build that produces the artifact and provenance. And then when you go to publish, it gets checked somehow against some expectations. Vita, if you remember, Vita had a diagram, I can't pull it up easily. And say that like, to do salsa, you do that. And then the requirements can kind of go into the details of like what, once you're in that frame of reference and in that model, here's the kind of the checks that happen. Does that sound okay to folks?
Sounds good.
Okay, so then in the V1 document, I will basically just say like, we will introduce it somehow, the details we haven't yet worked out, but we're going to try to iterate on it, looking at actual, like we'll kind of do it in the pull requests or in further review once we actually have something to look at. Right. So then finally, the last thing, in terms of implementation, there's a list of like clarifications and resolving like what specific things, like the one from before that we just talked about a minute ago or half an hour ago, like triaging what issues are going to be, make the cut for 1.0 and which ones don't, that we could do in the future. In terms of how we actually do the 1.0 implementation, I suggested in the doc that we create like a draft branch that I would say doesn't even require code review. We push it out, we iterate on it, and then we kind of review it in bulk. Instead of having folks review every single commit or every single pull request, we kind of iterate it on there and then just kind of review the mostly final doc. We could always break it up into chunks then, but I suspect there's going to be a lot of iteration where before we fully release it. that it'll be easier to just do that and publish that to some website that's not the official website, but like is in some draft website with clear marking that it's draft and unreviewed. I think also maybe help these discussions a little bit better, because then, we could have ideas and say like, oh, I wrote this. What does this look like? Something like that. Okay, sounds good. Anything else on the 1.0 before we move on to the next topic? Okay, Melba and Company hybrid OSS and proprietary scenario.
Yeah, I am going to share this. This is in the specification Slack channel. Before we had vacation / breaks, we were asked to kind of come together to create what would it look like if you have a hybrid scenario where you have some proprietary, some open source. So after much discussion, this is kind of what it came out to, based off of 2 different scenarios. Obviously, we would like input, but not certain if this is what was what you were looking for in terms of how the hybrid approach would potentially be tackled / visualized. So essentially, there's an internal user requesting open source software. There's some sort of internal vetting, and there could either be a link to where the upstream repo is, or there could be a complete clone into an internal mirror. And there would be some sort of record that says, okay, this open source repo is approved. Additionally, during the build process, depending on which scenario it is, right, there's the internal repo that has proprietary software along with, any open source dependencies. And again, depending on if it's scenario 1 or scenario 2, it would go and copy that open source code, whether it be directly to the internet or via the internal mirror, and then obviously complete the build. So this is just kind of a high level how a hybrid scenario may work. So again, looking for feedback and thoughts on if this was the direction that you wanted us to go in. And Marcella, I know you're on, so if you wanted to add any more color to that, feel free.
Yeah, I think, hopefully you can hear me. I think one of the next steps, I hadn't gotten a chance to look at this cleaned up version, but I think it makes a lot of sense and you captured our discussion very well. But what I've been trying to think about as well is how do we translate this back into SLSA provenance requirements, right? And yeah, how do we essentially capture this in the provenance? Yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about. And I think that should be the goal.
So with proprietary, right, provenance is going to be internal. So does the team have thoughts on the level of detail for proprietary code, given that it is proprietary and there's certain things that may or may not be disclosed for a variety of reasons?
No, Mark has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead.
Is this about the consumption of open source in a proprietary code, or about the publication of proprietary code that includes open source components?
Correct. I believe it's the latter. Marcella,
Okay.
did you think
Yeah.
otherwise?
I think it's honestly both. You know, on the one hand, from the sort of enterprise proprietary perspective, what can we learn about the provenance of open source code we are consuming? And also, once we publish that, what does this hybrid sort of provenance look like to the downstream consumers of this hybrid code? I think it's both personally.
Yeah, I guess I could just give you my personal thoughts. I had been thinking of these as kind of two somewhat separable problems, where if we think of SLSA as like an individual like atom that we have to like use to assemble some larger secure system. With the consumption, like the ingestion of open source, there we're using SLSA to make sure that the input software hasn't been tampered with. And if you're importing from source, then I guess there's one question of like, especially if we remove the source requirements, like does SLSA even apply? Or I think the build requirements are kind of trivially met because the code isn't built, right? Like you're just doing git, for example, and it's, has the same hash, so it hasn't been tampered with. Maybe there's something about like what the upstream repo is. Because like once it comes in your doors, now it's like an internal problem as opposed to external. For publishing of closed source software, kind of like on the outside, I think that's an open question. Like an organization could use it on like the internal side of like, my company wants to make sure that no internal users have the ability to like tamper with and publish any stuff that we give to our users. But that's like a purely internal thing. But for consumers, I don't know if there's a way for them to know like how did we build our closed source software according to our own internal stuff that they can't look at. I don't know. Enumerating what all of the open source things were in it seems like a related thing, which is like SBOM and vulnerability management, right? Because like you want to make sure that the things that are going into it. But in my mind, it seems like the tampering protection, I don't know how we would do that yet.
Since SBOM is kind of like a mechanism to relay the provenance, wouldn't like the hash and etc. be in the SBOM, so then you could, in theory, say this was built properly based off of the original source, because you could relay that information, and then the build artifacts on top of that probably would support that SBOM and the way it was generated. Just guessing here.
Yeah, or maybe another way of to say if you have a closed source build, meaning that the consumers of the software that you're building can't look at the build service or all of the inputs, then instead of outputting the SLSA provenance directly, you'd probably output an SBOM, which is some sort of aggregate attestation, which is like an SBOM or the VSA, the verification summary attestation, saying we did do SLSA. We can't show you all the inputs because they're proprietary, but we're making a claim that we did do it.
Okay, I know we're over or on at the top of the hour.
Okay, sounds good. So I guess we'll see everyone at the next next meeting. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.